They brought me here on a day so bright it almost felt cruel, sunlight spilling across the pavement while the air inside was stale and still. The walls held a silence that wasn't peace, but something heavier, as if every breath carried the weight of someone who had been forgotten. Faces passed in the hall, some empty, some curious, but none stayed long enough to see the truth in mine. What they couldn't see was that under the coat, behind the cane, I carried something they couldn't take from me, something that would one day turn this place inside out. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what you think happens when the quietest person in the room holds the sharpest hand. Like this video, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments so I know you're ready for the rest. I remember that morning with a clarity that still makes my jaw tighten. The sunlight was sharp and golden, spilling across my kitchen table as I finished my coffee, steam curling in the air like a slow whisper. Bradley appeared in the doorway without calling ahead, wearing a neatly pressed shirt and polished shoes, looking more like a man heading to a business meeting than a casual lunch with his father. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind of smile you give when you've already decided something and don't want to hear protest. "Thought we'd grab lunch together, Dad," he said, his tone light, his keys swinging in his hand in a nervous rhythm. The idea of having lunch with my son felt almost foreign. We hadn't done that in months, maybe even a year. So I agreed without question. My coat hung by the door, my cane rested against the wall, and I followed him to the car, thinking maybe, just maybe, he was trying to make up for lost time. The drive began like any other, with familiar streets rolling past the window, but before long the scenery changed. The houses I recognized gave way to sterile office buildings, then to neighborhoods I had never seen before. I asked where we were going, but he just said, "Shortcut, less traffic," and kept his eyes fixed on the road. It was then that I noticed my old leather suitcase in the back seat. I hadn't packed it. The sight of it made my chest feel heavy, but when I reached back to shift it toward me, I realized something was wrong. It felt too light. My hands knew that weight by heart, and half of it was gone. My tool bag wasn't there either, nor the small box of mementos I kept by my bed. I started to speak, but Bradley interrupted with a casual, "Don't worry about it, just clothes for later," as if that answered anything. The hum of the tires slowed as we turned into a driveway flanked by trimmed hedges and a sign I barely had time to read: Willow Acres Residential Care. The words hit me like a cold wave. Residential care. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. The car rolled to a stop, and without a word, Bradley stepped out, walked around to my door, and opened it with deliberate slowness, like a man unveiling something he'd been planning for a while. "Let's get you inside," he said, and the words were wrong in every way. I reached for my cane, the tip striking the pavement with a hollow sound that echoed the emptiness settling in my chest. As I stepped out, I saw him already lifting my suitcase, pushing it ahead toward the entrance, never once offering his arm. That was when I knew this wasn't lunch. The air smelled faintly of bleach and overwatered plants, and the closer we got to the door, the more the sunlight seemed to fade. Inside, the lobby was painted a pale yellow that might have been cheerful if not for the flickering overhead light and the faint smell of overcooked vegetables. Behind the counter sat a woman with hair pulled so tight it seemed to stretch her skin, her eyes as sharp as her voice when she asked, "New resident?" Bradley didn't hesitate. "Yes." The words sliced into me. She slid a clipboard across the desk, its pages marked with my name at the top and phrases like permanent care arrangement and long-term stay. My fingers itched to grab it, to rip it in half, but Bradley had already taken the pen, signing with quick strokes that showed he had no interest in reading what he was committing me to. The pen scratched across the paper, final and cold. I stood there, rooted to the floor, watching my son make decisions about my life without my consent, his face calm, as if he were paying a utility bill. The receptionist handed him a laminated visitor pass and a small plastic card with my name on it. "This is for his room," she said, not looking at me. Bradley placed the card in my palm and gave my shoulder a perfunctory pat, the kind you give to someone you're saying goodbye to at a bus station. "I'll come by next week," he said, voice light but his eyes already elsewhere. Before I could form a single word, he turned and walked toward the glass doors. I followed him with my eyes until they shut behind him, the sound muffled but final. The lobby felt colder suddenly, the hum of a distant television the only sound. I stared at the plastic card in my hand, the ridges pressing into my skin, leaving small marks. That little rectangle of plastic was supposed to be my key to this place, but it felt more like a lock. She was seated behind a wide mahogany desk that looked like it belonged in a law office, not a care home, and she didn't look up when I approached. Her fingers danced across a keyboard for a moment before she slid a clipboard across the desk toward me, the motion quick and dismissive. I glanced down at the forms, and the words "indigent admission" stared back at me in bold type. My chest tightened. Those words didn't describe me. I had savings. I had investments. I was not a man who needed charity. But here, on this paper, Evelyn had already decided who I was. "Sign there," she said flatly, still not meeting my eyes. I cleared my throat, trying to push back, but her head tilted just enough for me to catch the faint glimmer of impatience in her eyes. "It's standard," she added, which only made the weight of the insult heavier. As I hesitated, an aide came into the office carrying the suitcase Bradley had brought in yesterday. The aide sat on the floor, unzipped it, and started pulling my clothes out one by one, tagging them with small stickers that looked like price labels. I stared, my grip on the pen tightening. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice low but steady. The aide didn't answer. He looked at Evelyn, who finally glanced up, her eyes sweeping over me like I was an object she was appraising. "We're tagging your personal items for resale. Storage space is limited, and we prioritize paying residents." The casual cruelty of her tone burned hotter than any insult. It wasn't just what she said, it was the assumption that I was too powerless to stop her. As if to underline the point, she turned her attention back to her screen, her hands moving as if my presence in the room was a minor inconvenience. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the urge to slam the pen down and walk out, but the memory of Bradley's retreating figure at the door stopped me cold. I had nowhere to walk out to, so I signed the damn paper, each stroke of the pen deliberate, as if engraving the memory into my mind for later use. When I slid the clipboard back to her, she didn't even thank me. She just plucked it from my hands, stacked it neatly on her desk, and nodded to the aide to continue. My shirts and jackets were stuffed into a clear plastic bag with a number written in black marker across the front. The long tables were lined with plates of scrambled eggs, toast, and fruit, the kind of plain but decent breakfast you could at least get through without complaint. When I reached the end of the line, a young kitchen worker slid a plate toward me, and I immediately noticed it wasn't the same as the others. The plate itself had a hairline crack running along one edge, and the portion was barely half of what the man ahead of me had received. 2 pale eggs, a single slice of toast, and no fruit. I held the plate for a moment, thinking it must have been a mistake, but when I asked, the worker glanced nervously toward the back corner where Evelyn stood with her arms folded. She approached slowly, her heels clicking against the tile, and looked down at my plate as if she were appraising a faulty product. "Special diet," she said without warmth, "cost saving." The words landed with a strange mix of mockery and finality, as if she had just labeled me a burden in front of the entire room. I didn't push back. Not here, not now. Instead, I carried the cracked plate to an empty table and ate every bite. Not because it was satisfying, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me leave food untouched. After breakfast, I returned to my room to find a handyman standing on a step stool beside my window, a hammer in one hand and nails in the other. He had already placed 2 nails into the frame and was lining up a third. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice firm. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but muttered, "Security policy." I looked at the window, the one source of fresh air in this cramped, stuffy room, and saw that the small pane that used to open was now sealed shut. The handyman avoided my eyes as he drove in the last nail, the metallic thud echoing in the small space. I could smell the faint trace of mold near the sill, a damp, earthy scent that told me the air in here needed to move, and now it never would. Evelyn's shadow appeared in the doorway just as he finished. Her lips curved into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We can't have residents wandering off or letting pests in," she said, as if sealing off the room like a coffin was a reasonable act of care. I stepped aside, watching her take a slow look around my space, her gaze lingering on the bare floor where my suitcase had once been. "We have to think about everyone's safety," she added, her tone dripping with the suggestion that I was the kind of man who might cause trouble if left unchecked. She left without waiting for a response, her heels clicking away down the hall. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the nailed window, and felt the air grow heavier with each passing minute. Families arrived, carrying flowers, store-bought cookies, and the kind of bright smiles people paste on for a couple of hours before they return to their real lives. I was standing near the community room doorway, watching an old man greet his granddaughter, when Evelyn took the microphone at the front of the room. She started with the usual pleasantries, thanking everyone for coming, reminding them of the bingo night schedule, then moved on to announcing a list of new residents. My name came third, and her voice shifted, gaining just enough volume to ensure no one missed what came next. "Mr. Walter Greaves," she said brightly, "has joined us recently because his children couldn't handle his medical bills." I felt the air still around me. Heads turned, some faces sympathetic, others blank. I had no medical bills. None. But Evelyn said it like it was a simple fact, like she was reading it from a chart. I didn't correct her. Not here, not with this audience, because I knew that would only cement her story as truth in their eyes. Instead, I stood still, my cane planted firmly on the floor, and met her gaze from across the room. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but the satisfaction of a hit landing exactly where she'd aimed. After the event, I returned to my room, only to stop short at my door. My nameplate, plain white plastic with black letters, was gone. In its place was a flimsy cardboard tag, the kind you'd find tied to a storage box, with the words "charity case" scrawled in thick black marker. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind processing not just the insult, but the brazenness of it. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, a petty jab behind closed doors. This was a label she intended every passerby to see, a permanent fixture until she decided otherwise. I reached up to remove it, but before my fingers could close around the string, a passing staff member, one of her loyal ones, shook his head. "Best not to touch it," he muttered, as if the cardboard tag carried more authority than the truth. I stepped in my room and shut the door, the faint laughter from down the hall bleeding through the thin walls. I could almost picture her in her office, leaning back in her chair, satisfied with the ripple she'd caused. Over the next few days, the tag remained. Residents passed my door, some glancing at it quickly, others slowing down to take a longer look. I could hear their whispers, some pitying, some curious, a few with that undertone of judgment Evelyn's voice had planted in their heads. And Evelyn, she walked past my room twice a day, each time letting her eyes linger on the sign, just long enough for me to know she was checking to see if it was still there. Without looking at me, he crossed the room to the shelf where I kept the few personal items I had left. My pulse quickened as I realized what was happening when he reached for the old leather-bound albums. Albums that held decades of my life and photographs. My late wife smiling in the spring sunshine, my children before they learned how to lie with their faces, the house I built with my own hands standing proud against the sky. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Storage space is for paying residents," he said flatly, not even glancing in my direction as he slid the albums into the bin like they were nothing but old junk mail. I rose from my bed, cane in hand, and stepped toward him, but he angled his body away, shielding the bin as if expecting me to fight him for it. My mind flashed back to the night Bradley drove me here. How light my suitcase had felt, how much of my life had already been stolen before I even crossed the threshold. Now, they were taking the rest, stripping away the last tangible pieces of who I was before Evelyn's walls closed in around me. The staff member left without another word, the bin clutched to his chest like a prize, and I followed him into the hall, watching him disappear around the corner toward the service area. I wanted to call after him to demand those albums back, but the image of Evelyn's smirk on visiting day flashed in my mind. I knew she was behind this, even if she hadn't given the order directly. This was how she operated, death by 1,000 cuts, always with just enough distance to keep her hands clean. I returned to my room to find 2 more staff members inside, one of them stripping the sheets from my bed while the other boxed up my remaining clothes. "You can't just take my room," I said, my voice low and controlled, but they didn't stop moving. "Reassignment," one of them replied, barely looking at me. "You've been moved to overflow." Overflow. The word landed like a weight in my stomach. They didn't even pretend to dress it up as something else. No room upgrade. No temporary arrangement. Just overflow, as if I were nothing more than excess inventory that needed to be tucked out of sight. They carried my things down a narrow hallway past the laundry room, past the maintenance closet, until we reached a door at the very end. When it opened, the smell of stale air and cleaning chemicals hit me all at once. The overflow wing was nothing like the other residential areas. The walls were bare concrete, the floor covered in mismatched tiles that rattled underfoot, and the room they led me to was barely large enough for a single bed pushed into the corner. A buzzing fluorescent light hung overhead, flickering just enough to make the shadows on the wall twitch. Cardboard boxes lined one side of the room, stacked high and covered in dust, with faded labels marking them as archive supplies. This wasn't a bedroom. It was a storage closet they'd shoved a bed into. The staff set my box of clothes at the foot of the bed and left without a word. I sat down slowly, the thin mattress springs groaning under me, and stared at the ceiling where the buzzing light cast an endless, cold glare. Every sound was louder here. The clank of pipes behind the wall, the shuffle of feet in the corridor, the faint rumble of the building's old heating system. It was meant to feel temporary, transient, unworthy of permanence, the kind of place you kept someone until they either disappeared quietly or broke under the strain. I ran my hand along the wall beside the bed, feeling the uneven texture of the paint, and thought about my photo albums now sitting in some donation bin, about the warm bed and sunlight in my old room, about the way Evelyn never had to be present for her orders to be carried out. This was her signature. Make the move look procedural, make it sound like policy, and no one could call it personal. But to me, it was personal. Those tools weren't just objects. They were the proof of every home I'd built, every repair I'd made with my own hands, the legacy of work that had shaped my back and my life. Then, one afternoon, as I walked past the maintenance area, I saw an open receipt book on the counter, and my heart stopped. In a list of items sold to a local flea market vendor, my tool set was right there, written in block letters next to a price so low it might as well have been a joke. I stepped into the room and asked the handyman, A thin man with deep lines around his mouth. What had happened? He wouldn't meet my eyes. It was an accident, he said, the words stiff and rehearsed. I didn't know they were yours. But he knew. Everyone here knew about the man in the overflow wing, the one Evelyn had tagged as a charity case, the one she was slowly stripping down to nothing. And sure enough, as I stood there, Evelyn appeared in the doorway like she'd been waiting for this moment. Her lips curved into that cold smile, and she said, "Guess you won't need those here." She didn't raise her voice, didn't have to. Her tone dripped with that false sweetness she used whenever she wanted her cruelty to sting a little more. I wanted to tell her those tools were worth more than this whole building's furniture, that they were a part of me she had no right to touch, but I knew she thrived on getting a reaction. So I didn't give her one. I just stared at her, and something in my silence seemed to irritate her because she stepped aside and let me pass without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of those tools sitting on some flea market table gnawing at me like a stone in my shoe. I decided to go to the lounge, the only place in this building where you could at least pretend to have some freedom, maybe read until morning. But when I got there, I found the door locked, the lights inside already off. The schedule said it was open until midnight, and my watch told me it was barely 10. I knocked once, then again, and when no one came, I went to find the night aide. He was sitting behind the desk, scrolling on his phone, and without looking up, he said, "Lounge is closed." I told him I left my book in there, but he just shrugged and went back to whatever was on his screen. I wasn't in the mood to return to my room, not to that windowless storage cell they called overflow. So I stayed in the hallway for a while, leaning on my cane, thinking. After about an hour, when the halls were empty and silent, I walked back to the lounge door and found it slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cooler here, the kind that made you want to sit back and breathe for a while. I sank into one of the sofas, the cushions worn but comfortable, and for the first time all day, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen just a little. But I hadn't been there long before I heard the distinct click of the lock behind me. I turned to see the night aide standing in the doorway, smirking. "Lights out," he said, and before I could respond, he pulled the door shut. The sound of the lock sliding into place was louder than it should have been. I stood and tried the handle, it didn't budge. The realization hit me. He'd locked me inside like an animal in a cage. I could have pounded on the door, but that would have brought Evelyn down on me in the morning with some smug comment about wandering residents. So I didn't. I turned back to the sofa, sat down, and pulled an old throw blanket over my legs. The overhead lights had been switched off, but the glow from the security cameras in the corners was enough to see by, their red recording lights blinking like silent sentinels. I could feel them on me, watching, capturing every shift of my body, every tilt of my head. That night, I didn't sleep much. The hum of the building was different here after dark, deep and steady, punctuated by the occasional metallic groan of the pipes. I thought about my tools, about every nail I'd ever driven into wood, about the hands that had shaped my life's work, and how Evelyn had managed to take them away from me without even lifting a finger herself. I thought about the way she smiled when she said I wouldn't need them, as if my usefulness ended the moment I stepped through Willow Acres doors. She ran this place like it was her private kingdom, but kingdoms fall when their rot is exposed, and I knew that rot was here. It was in the way staff cut corners, in the constant hum of broken equipment, in the flicker of unsafe lighting and the smell of mold in my old room. So I began my work, quiet and steady, the way I used to approach building a house. Measure twice, cut once, and make every move count. I started by approaching the head of maintenance, an older man named Curtis, telling him I had time on my hands and experience in repairs. I made it sound like a hobby, something to keep me busy, but the truth was I wanted to see the inner workings of this place. Curtis, overworked and understaffed, didn't mind the help. I offered to look over their maintenance logs, pretending to check for incomplete repairs, but really I was searching for patterns. Rooms with repeated mold complaints that were marked resolved without anyone fixing them. Fire alarms noted as faulty but never replaced. Doors with broken locks in the so-called secure wing. I took mental snapshots of every entry, memorizing dates and details, and when no one was looking, I jotted them down in a small notepad I kept hidden in the lining of my jacket. From there, I started taking walks at odd hours, cane in hand, looking for anything out of place. I found frayed extension cords snaking across hallways, blocked fire exits, storage rooms with chemicals stacked dangerously close to heating vents. Every time I spotted something, I recorded it, even if I couldn't write it down immediately. I became a quiet observer, moving through the building like a shadow. No one noticed. The opportunity to expand my reach came one afternoon when I saw Evelyn walking toward the garden with one of the facility's accountants, a slim man in a beige suit. I followed at a distance, keeping to the far side of the path where the hedges were high and thick. They stopped near the fountain, their voices low but clear enough in the open air for me to hear. Evelyn was laughing softly, a sound I had never heard from her before, and the words that followed made my jaw clench. "It's easy money," she said, her voice laced with amusement. "Half the state funding is for residents who aren't even here. We pad the invoices, bill for meals, meds, everything. As long as the paperwork looks good, no one asks questions." The accountant chuckled like they were sharing a harmless joke, but I heard the truth in it. Fraud, pure and simple, bleeding money from the state while real residents lived in moldy rooms and ate from cracked plates. "What about inspections?" the accountant asked. Evelyn waved her hand dismissively. "We know when they're coming. A quick cleanup, a few stage repairs, and they're out the door. They don't want to be here any more than we want them here." My grip on my cane tightened until my knuckles whitened. This was bigger than her petty games with me. She wasn't just a tyrant. She was a criminal, and she was confident enough to brag about it in the open air. I stayed still until they moved back toward the building, her heels clicking against the stone path, his polished shoes following in perfect rhythm. I waited another 5 minutes before heading back inside, my mind already weaving this into the fabric of my plan. If I could document her violations and connect them to her own words, she wouldn't just lose her job, she'd lose everything. That evening, back in the overflow wing, I carefully folded a page from my notepad, the one where I had written false billing and phantom residence in small, precise letters, and slipped it into a hollow space behind the vent cover in my room. I had replayed the conversation I overheard in the garden so many times in my head that I could recite her smug tone word for word. But information without power is just paper in a drawer, and I knew the only way to take her down was to own the ground she stood on. I had the resources. That was the part she had never guessed. The investments I had quietly nurtured over the years, the partnerships I had formed in industries far removed from woodworking, the property I had sold at exactly the right time. They had all been waiting for a purpose, and now they had one. In the weeks before this morning, I had been in touch with a lawyer I trusted, a man who didn't waste words and didn't blink when I told him what I wanted. We moved quickly, quietly, buying up the debt tied to Willow Acres, negotiating with the absentee owners who had been letting Evelyn run the place like her personal fiefdom. Piece by piece, the ownership shifted until there was only one signature left to secure. I signed it 3 days before this morning and told my lawyer to schedule the final paperwork delivery for a time when the building would be at its busiest. That time was now. The rumble of delivery trucks echoed through the front drive as I stepped out of the overflow wing, cane tapping a steady rhythm on the linoleum. The smell of fresh varnish and polished steel drifted in from the open doors as workers unloaded crates of luxury furniture. gleaming stainless steel appliances, and richwood tables that made the current dining hall look like a high school cafeteria. Staff members paused mid-task to watch the procession, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Even Curtis, the maintenance man, stood in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag and muttering, "What the hell is all this?" Evelyn emerged from her office, her heels clicking faster than usual, her voice sharp as she demanded to know why no one had informed her of any deliveries. One of the drivers, a broad-shouldered man in a branded polo, simply gestured toward the lobby when my lawyer had just stepped inside carrying a slim leather briefcase. I followed him in, my steps unhurried, my cane striking the tile with the precision of a drumbeat. Evelyn's eyes landed on me, narrowing instantly. "What is this?" she asked, her tone dripping with authority, but I saw the first flicker of doubt in her gaze. My lawyer ignored her and set the briefcase on a reception desk, flipping it open to reveal a stack of neatly arranged documents. He addressed the gathered staff, his voice carrying the calm weight of someone used to delivering decisive news. As of this morning, the sale of Willow Acres Residential Care has been finalized. All assets, operations, and personnel now fall under the direction of its sole investor. He paused then, letting the silence stretch just long enough for every head in the room to turn toward me. "Mr. Walter Greaves." The air seemed to shift all at once. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, footsteps halted, the clink of tools and trays stilled. Evelyn's expression froze, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. I let the moment hang, drinking in the change in the room. The sudden awareness that the man they had labeled charity case was now the one holding the keys to their future. I stepped forward, resting both hands on the top of my cane, and looked Evelyn directly in the eye. "From this point forward," I said, my voice steady but carrying enough edge to slice through the tension, "things will be different here." Her jaw tightened, the muscles in her neck flexing as she tried to collect herself. "You can't just," she began, but my lawyer's voice cut her off. "The contracts are signed, the funds are transferred, and the change of ownership has been recorded. It's done." The staff began exchanging looks, some curious, some hopeful, a few openly relieved. I knew in that moment which ones would stay and which ones would scatter like leaves in the wind. Evelyn, however, stayed rooted to the spot, her pride battling with the sudden reality that she was no longer in control. I could see her calculating, searching for some angle, some way to spin this in her favor. But there was no spin that could erase the truth. I didn't move toward her right away. I let her stand there in that moment, suspended between the life she thought she controlled and the reality that had just crushed it. Then I gave a nod to my lawyer, and within minutes, 2 members of the administrative staff entered her office with empty boxes. They began removing framed photos, stacks of files, and personal knickknacks from her desk with brisk efficiency, placing each one into the boxes without ceremony. Evelyn turned toward me, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't say anything. Not because she didn't have words, but because she knew anything she said now would be overheard by the people she'd spent years intimidating. I watched her hands twitch slightly as she reached for the key ring clipped to her belt, her fingers lingering on the largest key, the one that opened her office. "You can hand that to me," I said, my voice low but carrying enough authority to leave no room for hesitation. She unclipped it slowly, the movement stiff, and placed it in my palm without meeting my gaze. The metal was warm from her hand, but in that moment it felt cold as finality. "Your access to the administrative wing is revoked effective immediately," I continued, speaking clearly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "Security will escort you to collect the remainder of your belongings." You'll be given a copy of your termination letter before you leave the property." Her breath hitched almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since I'd met her, the smug tilt of her head was gone. She straightened her shoulders, as if trying to salvage the last scraps of dignity, but the stiffness in her movements betrayed her. I didn't look away as she was escorted down the hall, her steps slower than usual, her heels clicking less like the confident strikes I'd come to associate with her, and more like the hesitant taps of someone walking toward the end of something they thought would last forever. The staff watched quietly, some with satisfaction in their eyes, others with a guarded relief that suggested they'd been waiting for this day but never dared hope it would come. Once Evelyn was out of sight, I called Curtis over. "There's someone I want to see back here," I told him. He nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, because he already knew who I meant. 10 minutes later, the janitor she had fired months ago for being too slow walked through the door. His name was Harold, a man in his 60s with shoulders still broad from a lifetime of labor, and the kind of steady, deliberate way of moving that some people mistake for sluggishness. Evelyn had seen only what she wanted, a man who didn't fit her image of efficiency. But I had seen something else entirely: patience, care, and pride in his work. I offered him the position of head of operations right there in the lobby, telling him he'd be responsible not just for maintenance, but for overseeing the general upkeep of the facility. The look in his eyes was worth every second of planning it had taken to get to this moment. He shook my hand with a grip that felt like an anchor, solid and unshakable. With Harold in place, I turned my attention to the aides, the ones who had mocked residents, taken part in Evelyn's petty humiliations, or looked the other way when she stripped people of their dignity. I called them together in the common room, every one of them standing in a loose, uneasy semicircle as I addressed them. "If you worked here under Evelyn, you already know I've seen and heard more than you think. Some of you will have a place here going forward. Others will not. That choice is yours to make, starting now." I laid out the terms in plain language. Anyone who wanted to stay would undergo immediate retraining under Harold's supervision, with a focus on resident dignity, safety, and transparency. Any refusal to meet those standards meant immediate termination. There were no negotiations, no middle ground. A few aides exchanged defiant glances, and I could already tell they wouldn't last the week. Others looked down at their shoes, shame coloring their faces, the weight of their past behavior settling in. I didn't coddle them, and I didn't offer false comfort. This wasn't about revenge for the petty things they'd done to me. It was about building a place where no one would endure what I had endured here. One of the aides, a tall man named Rick who had once accidentally locked me in the lounge, raised his hand to speak, but lowered it again when I met his eyes. I could see him calculating, realizing that whatever Evelyn had taught them about control no longer applied. This wasn't her building anymore, and I wasn't her victim. I dismissed the group, leaving them to consider their futures, and spent the next several hours walking through the facility with Harold, making notes on everything that needed immediate attention: the mold in the walls, the broken locks, the unsafe wiring. It didn't take long after Evelyn's departure for the air inside Willow Acres to change. The hallways no longer carried that constant low hum of tension. The staff no longer moved with eyes cast downward, and the residents, many of whom had stopped expecting anyone to listen, began to speak up about what they needed. The first place I turned my attention to was the overflow wing, that storage closet with a bed where I had been dumped to fade away. I had hated it at first, hated the buzzing fluorescent light and the boxes that lined the walls, but now I saw it for what it could be: a place of creation, a room that could turn nothing into something. With Harold's help, we cleared out the dust-covered supplies and scrubbed every inch of the floor and walls. The cracked tiles were replaced with polished wood planks that smelled faintly of cedar, the kind of scent that warms a space before you even step inside. I called in a favor from an old friend who still dealt in antique tools. And within a week, my workbench was stocked with planes, saws, chisels, and clamps that felt like extensions of my own hands. Word spread quickly among the residents, and soon I had a small crowd watching as I worked, their eyes following the curl of wood shavings as they fell to the floor. I began teaching them in small groups how to sand a surface until it felt like glass beneath their fingers, how to drive a nail straight without bending it, how to fit pieces together so tightly that they became one. We made birdhouses that hung in the garden, chairs that replaced the splintered ones in the lounge, and picture frames for the faded photographs residents kept tucked away in drawers. Every project carried a story, and every story built a bridge between people who had once been strangers in the same building. It wasn't just about the objects we created, it was about giving back the dignity that Evelyn had stripped away piece by piece. The sound of laughter started returning to the halls, carried on the scent of freshly cut wood and varnish. The workshop became the heartbeat of Willow Acres, a place where residents could leave behind the labels they'd been given and remember the skills, the patience, and the worth they still carried within themselves. And just when it felt like the past had settled into its rightful place, Bradley walked back into my life. He showed up one afternoon in the lobby, looking older than I remembered, his shirt wrinkled, his tie loose around his neck. The receptionist buzzed my office, and when I came out to see him, he gave me a thin smile that didn't quite mask the desperation in his eyes. "Dad," he started, "I've hit a rough patch. I was hoping you might be able to help me out with a loan." For a moment, I simply studied him, this man who had driven me here without warning, who had walked away without looking back. I thought about the day he left me standing in this lobby with nothing but a plastic key card, and I thought about the people upstairs now building something new from the scraps of what she had left behind. Then I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a crisp form, and slid it across the counter toward him. "If you need a place to stay," I said evenly, "we have rooms available. Of course, all applications are subject to a strict vetting process." His eyes flickered between me and the paper, as if trying to decide whether I was serious. I didn't blink. I didn't explain. I simply let the weight of the moment settle between us. He picked up the form slowly, his fingers tightening on the edges, and for the first time in years, I saw him without the shield of his own pride. Without another word, he folded the paper and left, the glass door swinging shut behind him. I didn't watch him go. I turned back toward the hall that led to the workshop, where the sound of hammering and quiet conversation filled the air. The people in that room were my family now, bound not by blood but by shared resilience. As I stepped inside, one of the residents, a woman named Doris who had once been too timid to speak above a whisper, held up a newly built birdhouse and smiled. "Where should we put this one?" she asked. I looked at the smooth lines, the care in its construction, and I realized that every nail, every joint, every polished surface was a piece of proof that what had been broken here could be made whole again. My legacy wasn't the building I now owned or the title I carried. It was the lives that would never again be pushed into the shadows, the voices that would never again be silenced, and the knowledge that no one could take from us the dignity we had rebuilt together. The end. If you followed me through this story, you know it's not just about what happened to me. It's about what can happen to anyone who's underestimated, written off, or pushed aside. I want to know what you think. Did you expect things to turn out this way? Was there a moment where you thought I'd finally break? Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because I'd like to see how far this message can reach. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories where the tables turn and the truth wins, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Your support helps me keep telling them.